Hi, this is episode 5 in Cases of the Four Courts, which is a series about famous 19th century cases which took place in the Four Courts, Dublin, Ireland, which you can see behind me. So the case I want to talk about today is a case from the 1840s called Buck and Murphy. But to understand this case, you need to know the background of a person who's very important to it. And that is a lady called Anna Maria Bennett Little. And Anna Maria Bennett Little was a courtesan, and she was loved by the Irish nobility and the Irish gentry. And she kept ending up in court because a gentleman kept leaving her property in wills, which were subsequently challenged. So what was Anna Maria Bennett Little's background? Well, she came from Somerset, where she was the daughter of a butcher. And she lived with a number of men after her marriage broke up, before meeting, in the early 1830s, an Irish gentleman from Spiddal called John Stanislaus Cummin. And after meeting Mr. Cummin, Anna Maria Bennett Little moved to Ireland. And she spent a year or two in Dublin. Although she didn't much like it, she said Dublin didn't like her and she didn't like Dublin, and she changed lodgings 11 times when she was here. But while she was here, she made a new friend because she placed an advertisement in the newspaper saying that a young lady of great personal attractions was in need of a loan of money. And she got a response to her newspaper advertisement from a very important gentleman indeed, a gentleman known as Lord Langford, who owned a huge Georgian house in Summerhill and was one of the leading figures in the Anglo-Irish aristocracy. So by the time she left Ireland, Mrs. Little had not just one protector in Mr. Cummin, but two protectors in the form of Mr. Cummin and Lord Langford, who seemed to get on quite well together. Unfortunately, tragedy was in store for the trio. So this tragedy occurred in Piccadilly in 1834, when Mr. Cummin, who was a very young gentleman at the time, he was only in his early 20s, and Mr. Cummin was mysteriously thrown out of a cab. They never found the driver of the cab, and was killed. And after his death, a will was produced by Mrs. Little, in which Mr. Cummin left her an annuity of £500 per annum, which was a large amount of money at the time. In the meantime, Mrs. Little was living by this stage with Lord Langford in London. And indeed, Lord Langford's furniture and his children had also moved into Mrs. Little's house. So what was happening with Lady Langford at the time? Because there was a Lady Langford. Well, Lady Langford was in the divorce court in the English courts. And she was not in the divorce court, sorry, she was peripherally involved in proceedings that Lord Langford had taken in the English courts against his son's former tutor. And the basis of the proceedings was that his son's former tutor had had a relationship with Lady Langford. And at the time there was an action known as an action for criminal conversation, which a husband could bring against a man who had slept with that husband's wife. And that was the action that Lord Langford brought against the tutor, who was Mr. Bowers. But in court it came out in the evidence that Lord Langford had actually engaged this tutor after he had commenced his relationship with Mrs. Little, and that he had encouraged the tutor to amuse Lady Langford, and had actually bought the tutor a copy of Barnes' Don Juan so that he could read it together with Lady Langford. So the upshot was that the jury did find that there had been criminal conversation, but only awarded Lord Langford damages of 1 farthing. So reading between the lines, it seems that Mrs. Little was pushing Lord Langford to maybe end his marriage, and that this was kind of the lead up to a divorce. He'd get the finding of criminal conversation, and then he would divorce Lady Langford. But Lord Langford never got to divorce Lady Langford, because Lord Langford actually died in 1839, not that long after his relationship with Mrs. Little had started. And he may have been hastened to his end by a legal dispute which commenced in the English courts between Mrs. Little and Lady Langford, and it was all over the furniture. because Lady Langford had gone to Mrs. Little's house to take back the furniture, which she said was hers under a marriage settlement, and Mrs. Little had set the dog on her, but Lady Langford had got away with some of the furniture. So Mrs. Little brought proceedings to recover the furniture, but her claim was rejected by the English courts on the ground that the furniture belonged to Lady Langford. So this is the point at which the drama moves back to the Four Courts in Dublin. Because Lord Langford, like Mr. Comyn, had left a will in favour of Mrs. Little, and in fact this will was much more favourable to Mrs. Little because it didn't just leave her an annuity, it left her all of Lord Langford's property, including his big mansion in Summerhill in County Meath. So Mrs. Little was also given the right under the will to appoint whoever she wanted as trustee of this property to look after it for her. And Mrs. Little appointed a gentleman known as Mr. Buck as trustee of this property. So Mr. Buck was now the trustee and the legal owner of all the Langford property, including the house at Summerhill. So you probably guessed it at this stage that this Mr. Buck, appointed as trustee by Mrs. Little, is also the Mr. Buck in the case of Buck and Murphy. So who was Murphy? Murphy was Lord Langford's solicitor, and he was trying to get the Langford family to challenge the will in favour of Mrs. Little. And it seems that Mrs. Little and Mr. Buck may have sought to stitch up Mr. Murphy, because they brought rather Mr. Buck, but I'm sure he was acting at Mrs. Little's instigation, brought a criminal prosecution against Mr. Murphy for perjury. And they claimed that Mr. Murphy had lied about a debt that he had said was owing to him by Mr. Langford, and they produced a letter allegedly in Mr. Murphy's handwriting admitting that the debt had been paid, which was contrary to what he'd sworn in affidavit. So that was the basis of the prosecution, which was a private prosecution. And Mrs. Bennett Little gave evidence at the prosecution, and she didn't get on very well with the opposing counsel, and there was a suggestion at one stage that she might be about to throw water over him, but there were few choice words about lawyers stated by her under cross-examination too. But I think the person who really did the damage in the case and who caused the prosecution to fail was Mr. Buck himself, because Mr. Buck admitted that he had been solely supported by Mrs. Bennett and that he'd known her for years and so on, and the implication was that he might perhaps have been Mrs. Bennett's pimp. He managed all her money. So that might have been a factor in the jury finding that Mr. Murphy was innocent, although Mr. Murphy's practice was damaged as a result of the prosecution. So what happened after Buck and Murphy? Well, a couple of things happened. Around the same time as Buck and Murphy, Mrs. Little brought proceedings to prove the will of Mr. Comyn from 1832. That will was rejected on the basis that it was a forgery. Evidence was given that Mrs. Little had been seen copying Mr. Comyn's handwriting while he was still alive. So the implication was she forged the will. The next step was proceedings were brought against Mrs. Little by the Langford children to try to get Summerhill back. And these proceedings were successful, not on the basis that Lord Langford's will was invalid, but on the basis that he had no property to leave, because it was argued successfully by the Langford children that Lord Langford's property, including Summerhill, most of it was tied up again in a premarital settlement, so that he wasn't free to dispose of it to Mrs. Little in his will. So they avoided challenging the validity of the will, but they effectively said the property wasn't Lord Langford's to leave, and they were successful in that. And Mrs. Little and Mr. Buck had to move out of Summerhill. But this wasn't the end of everything, because Mrs. Little then produced another will from Mr. Comyn, which dated from 1834, just before his death. And she spent the next 20 years in the Irish courts seeking to have this will admitted to probate. But she lost in 1865. She lost. It was held that this will was a forgery as well. Mr. Comyn was in Galway when the will was alleged to have been made in Hollywood. And that was the end of Mrs. Bennett Little.